very timely people out of respect. So we're going to talk about loving boundaries tonight, and uh, and boundaries, and in particular loving boundaries. But we have to start off with just sort of an understanding of what boundaries are, because we want to differentiate regular boundaries from loving boundaries. And so boundaries, essentially, when we think of them, we think of rules that we have for ourselves as to what is okay and what's not okay in our lives. What's okay, what's not okay, how we want to be spoken to, what our limitations are. You think of the term setting limits, how we set limits for ourselves. Essentially, setting a boundary for most people is saying what you don't want, what I don't want in my relationship. So that's sort of a general idea about what a boundary is. When we think of loving boundaries, it's a little bit different. So maybe you could say a little something about that difference.
Right. So as Craig said so well, that when we set a boundary, we do so because something's gone wrong in the relationship. A relationship that once pleased me is no longer pleasing me. In a relationship where we were having fun and we were connected, now all of a sudden we're disconnected, and it generally looks like this, because now you're doing this and now you're doing that, and you did this and you did that. And usually when we want to set a boundary, it's out of a complaint or a series of complaints that we come to the conclusion we can no longer tolerate. And once we start coming to conclusions about people, what we start to do is look for a lot of evidence that support those conclusions. He's selfish. She's self-absorbed. She just cares about herself. I mean, whatever it is, we come to these conclusions. And once we do, we just start seeing it. Oh, there it is, there it is, there it is. And then we come to the conclusion, even in the most extreme form, I can't be in a relationship with such a self-absorbed person.
Right. So you came up with this incredible analogy that I love about a river.
Yeah, so that was just today. I was on the treadmill, and in the morning of Monday, whatever topic we're thinking about, we start thinking about it. And so I was thinking about loving boundaries. And the problem with boundaries is, as Craig said, we focus on what we don't like. And I thought of it, it's like a river. And when I'm floating in the river, the water is the love, the connection, the beauty that takes place when we're together in relationship. Mm-hmm. But then what happens is that something happens, and it's like a rock. And then I'm swimming with you and everything's great, and then there's another rock. And then I'm swimming with you, and then there's another rock. And then I start looking back, like, that's like the third time this has happened, and that's when I start developing conclusions about you. So boundaries, regular boundaries happen because there's so many frickin' rocks in this river with you. That's all I can see, and I can't take it anymore. So I'm going to create a boundary so these rocks stay outside, away from me. A loving boundary, I still care about the rocks. A loving boundary, usually I have more insight into my part and my focus on the rocks, and that's really my part, because if I focus on the rocks, I'm going to get more rocks, right? So it takes responsibility for that, but it also takes into account this beautiful river that the two of us once floated together. It remembers that. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm creating a boundary, I'm also creating a reminder, and I'm putting into that conversation this beautiful river.
Right. Exactly.
And the boundary is for the sake of the beautiful river.
Right, right. For the love that we have.
The love that we have that I want to restore. This is what I want to do so that we don't keep crashing into these rocks.
Right. So, I think what happens when you are in that river of love and you see these boulders or these rocks that are sort of where we have to deal with, challenges or conflict in the relationship, we want to tend to address them head on, right? And those rocks or those boulders represent what we don't want in the river. And when we, if you know what the law of attraction is, when we focus on what we don't want, we tend to get more of what we don't want. And that's one of the problems with boundaries. And this is a little bit radical here, because most people would say, I need to tell my partner what I don't want. And I need to be very clear about that. Debbie and I have a different outlook on that, which we think you have to focus more on what you do want.
Or what you do have,
or what you do have.
And appreciate.
But that's not to ignore the boulders that are there. We're not suggesting you do that if possible, and it's not fraught with all kinds of, you know, terrible things that you really do feel are intruding on your, you know, your integrity or your sense of connection. You know, of course, we want you to address it, but again, there's a way to address it so that you're pointing out what you do want instead of what you do not want.
But you know, it's like when we even use those words, I think
Yeah.
you have to address it. For me, the energy is when things go wrong and something displeases me, I need to address it. So it's a problem, right?
Right.
And again, I think that energy just doesn't pay reverence and attention to the river, right? So
Right.
I would almost say when I run into a rock, I want to always remember and go back to the beautiful river that the rock lives within.
So that,
not to ignore it, but to remind myself.
Right.
Versus saying to myself, I've got to address that. Because when I say I've got to address that, all I see is that rock that I want to kick out of the way. And by the way, it's your fault that it's there. Right? It's different energy.
No, and Debbie, you're really good at that. And I really do appreciate it, is Debbie often will remind me of that stream, that river, that we need to come from a place of love. Always. And setting boundaries is no different. If we come from a place of resentment or anger when we're setting a boundary, it's just going to be a terrible situation. And typically the other person who you're trying to set the boundary with is going to feel like you're controlling them. You're trying to control them.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be very, very uncomfortable. There's going to be a lot of resistance. So I think what Debbie's saying, what you're saying is absolutely true. We've got to start from love. And
or return to it.
Or return
right?
to it.
When I'm standing on a rock and I'm upset it's there, is to dip your foot into the river.
Right.
We have a question.
Yeah, and I'm sure you might even get to this shortly, but someone asked you to give an example of a loving boundary and the language around it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. And we will get to that. We kind of plan to do a couple examples of setting boundaries that are just regular boundaries that could be, as you said, like more frustrated and angry and resentful, and then switch it around so that you can see what it may look like when it's a loving boundary.
Yeah, we'd like to do that for sure. We could do that now if you want. We could do a model of
Sure.
We had a couple of ideas. There's so many different things that come up in relationships where you want to set a boundary. One of the ones that we've come up with recently that we think everybody is struggling with. Do you want to do the COVID first?
Let me do COVID.
Okay, so COVID has really created a lot of issues around boundaries for people, right? Because there's some confusion, even with partners, as to social distancing, wearing masks, not touching surfaces, and some people are a little bit more strict than others in how those rules are followed. So Debbie and I thought we would play out an example of a couple where for one partner, it was more important to be a little bit more strict and the other one, not so much. So I'll be and this is not necessarily our case, but
yeah, we're in pretty much agreement, but we just thought it was a good example because it's fascinating to me what different opinions there are out there. And my philosophy is be respectful to the one that's the most concerned. Yeah. But we'll just kind of play it out where it's not going that way.
Yeah, so Debbie, I'm getting a little bit frustrated with the way you're handling the COVID situation. You see, I'm very concerned. I wear a mask wherever I go, even outside, even with friends, even with my kids when they're coming over here. When people are over here, you seem a little bit disconnected from that. You go out sometimes, I don't see you wear a mask. I don't see you washing your hands very much. And I certainly see you sometimes, not always, but sometimes you're not social distancing. And I think we need to, I'm pretty scared. And I think, I don't want to get it from you of all people. So I'm wondering if you could just come on, get with it. I mean, the science says what it says. You've been reading the science. We're supposed to be wearing masks and distancing. Don't you care?
Well, I do care, but I think we just have different viewpoints of it. I mean, I've got my way of dealing with it and you've got your way of dealing with it. So Why do I have to do it your way?
Because I don't want to get sick, and we know what the science
I don't
says.
think you're going to get sick.
Yeah, well, that's what you think, but you know what? Okay, so you guys get it. That's a
Okay.
I'm trying to set a boundary, and I'm trying to push my agenda, and it's not working. And of course,
Yeah.
it's not working because she feels like I'm trying to control her, and it's not a loving boundary. So
Because what he's doing is he's pointing out all the things that I'm doing that are wrong, right? And then kind of in a certain way demanding that I do it your way.
right.
Right.
So, for me, doing this now in a loving way, it allows for Debbie to be more compassionate towards me, for me to be in my integrity about what I need and want from her. And I think it's more respectful all around. I'm being respectful to myself. Debbie's being respectful to me, hopefully. So I'm going to try to address this in a nicer, more loving way. So, Debbie, I really am having a lot of fear around COVID right now.
Really,
There's
Cindy?
an upswing. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard about the upswing.
That more and more people are getting it here in San Diego.
Yeah.
And I'm really scared, and I really
scared?
feel like, I'm taking every precaution as I can.
I know, I see you.
I'm
You're
wondering,
very diligent.
very, and I'm wondering if I'd like to make a request of you, really, because I'm
Okay.
feeling like, everybody has their own way of viewing this, but I was wondering if you could maybe pay more attention to being a little bit more strict. For example, when we go out to the supermarket, I know you wear a mask, and I'm really happy you wear a mask, but maybe you could wear it even walking into the supermarket from the car to this, because I see a lot of people getting connected with you.
Right.
And also, I'm wondering if there's any possibility that, when you go out with your friends and when your children come over here, if you could social distance from them, because they're coming in from the outside, and JB, he'll be doing jujitsu,
Right.
and we don't know. I'm wondering how you would be willing to be a little stricter about this for me.
Yeah, I could do that. I mean, I could do that.
Yeah.
I don't like wearing masks, but I can see where you're concerned, and I don't want you to be more concerned than necessary.
I appreciate
So
that.
I'll wear them when JB's here, and I'll wear them out of the car.
Yeah.
And that'll make you feel better?
It'll be a good start.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So, he's trying to convey, he's not putting it on me like you're doing this, but he's really putting it on him. And he's appealing to our relationship, and he's owning it. He's not blaming me.
Yeah.
And so when he does that, I'm feeling, like I don't want him to be upset. And because he's not blaming me, that I have the room to step into that concern that I do have for him.
That's true. I want to bring up another point, though. I have a relationship with Debbie where I feel comfortable bringing up my needs and my wants. Okay? There's no fear that it's going to be met with some hostility as long as I'm approaching it in a loving way. So I think one of the first steps in setting boundaries is you have to be willing to state what it is you want from your partner. In this particular case, I wanted her to be more respectful of my need for her to be more, concerned. And she was willing to do that. I could sit on that, which is what a lot of people do. I could sit on it, and the resentment could build and the anger could build. And that does nobody any good, because eventually it's going to come out, and it's going to come out sideways. So there's got to be a way to be able to be comfortable in your relationship where you're expressing what your boundaries are.
And again, I think, the key for me is to just remember the water. So it may sound like, sweetheart, I know you're like a free spirit and you hate that mask. I see you. You get out of the car and you're just like flipping it around until you get into the store, and I know you complain about the mask, because you just love the feel of the sun on your face, and I see it in your eyes how much you just love it without a mask, and I can see when you go into the store how difficult it is.
Right.
So that's like, it's the water, right? Like, I love you. You're just a free spirit, and I see that love you have for the fresh air.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's just where you focus.
It's where you focus. And, going back to being able to speak to what you need and want, a lot of people have a hard time setting boundaries for a number of different reasons. Um, First of all, we don't want to, ruffle the feathers, right? We don't want to, it's the path of least resistance. If I don't say anything,
Right.
it's a little easier, right? We think that. The other thing is we want to be liked. We want everybody to like us. So I don't want to say something that's going to push you away, God forbid. So, and of course, as Debbie was inferring earlier, we may just feel like we're right and they're wrong, which is oftentimes what it defaults to. I know what I need. I know what we need, and I'm going to tell you what we need. I'm right, you're wrong.
But usually when I'm sitting on right or wrong, I'll let you know about it.
Yeah.
But I think what you're talking about is so important is that, the person that, and we see it a lot in therapy, I don't think we have it with us so much, but who I need to tell her something, but I don't want to get her upset. Right. Because whenever I say something, she gets really upset.
Exactly.
And then when you check in with her, it's always like, well, why didn't you just let me know that?
Yeah.
Because you're sitting on it and I know you're angry and now I'm just taking it personally.
Yeah.
So when we sit on unsaid requests, the energy is still there, right?
Exactly.
And now I'm left to fill in the gaps. What's going on? And so I may say, what's the matter? What's the matter? What's the matter? And you say, nothing. You're sitting on an unmet request or a boundary or something's bothering you.
Right.
And so it doesn't go away because energetically it's still there.
Exactly.
So important to get it out.
I love what you just said too about requests. Because a boundary, we don't think about it, but a boundary typically is a request that needs to be made. And so if we can make that request, we're actually beginning to set a boundary in the relationship.
Yeah, and loving boundaries are oftentimes just simply loving requests.
Exactly.
I love you, and okay, we have another question.
What if you've set a boundary and your partner repeatedly crosses it? Is it okay to distance yourself?
Well, that's if you set a boundary. So I would love to talk. Is that person want to come on and talk about it? Can we ask?
It was something private.
Okay. So somebody sets a boundary and somebody repeatedly crosses it. The natural, when I set a boundary, first of all, let's go back to that. I'm focused on what I don't like, right? And so I'm already a little angry about it. I'm frustrated, I'm resentful. And so that caused me to set a boundary. And then if you repeatedly cross it, I'm going to get even more frustrated. And I'm going to come to the conclusion that no matter what I do, you just don't even respect me, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that where I'm going to go?
Probably.
So, it's like you're in your head and you're thinking and you're drawing a lot of conclusions and none of them are really good. And so again, it's remembering the water. So the water may be, we sat down, we talked about this boundary that I have because I'm really upset about it. And then I'm noticing that, you did it a few times. And I just want to talk about it because I love you. And I don't think that you're doing this on purpose to piss me off, but it's still happening. Mm-hmm. And I don't like the way I feel because I start focusing on that and I forget to focus on all the good. And I want to do that because you're amazing.
Yeah. I think the part that I liked about what you just shared is giving him the benefit of, or her, the benefit of the doubt, that, they're not doing it intentionally to hurt you, or, it may be perceived as an inconsiderate or disrespectful act. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, if you have asked before, you have to look at a couple of different things. I don't know what the boundary is, but if you've asked, maybe you haven't asked clearly enough. Sometimes the problem is with the ask, the request,
right,
not with the person doing the request. Clarity in that request is so important. I can't believe how many people make requests for a boundary and the request is vague, or the request is gray. It's not clear 100%.
I was thinking today, like, what are some of the boundaries that people cross and problems they have? And one of the ones that that shows up in my life is with people being late, because I have this thing about being respectful and showing up on time. Right. And so with friends, I have two of them that fall into this category. And they fall into the category in very different ways. Like one, her thing is, hey, I'm late because A happened, then B happened, then C happened. She shows up with a lot of excuses. And then I have another friend. I'll tell you later who it is. And he shows up like, hey, listen, I'm 10 to 15 minutes late, but I do it consistently. Just count on me being 10 to 15 minutes late. And I say, I love that, because then I just show up 10 to 15 minutes late and I don't have to sit there waiting for you. He says, exactly. It's just a crazy thing. It's how I rock and roll. And that's taking responsibility for it, right?
Yeah, good point.
But with the other one, it's really tough because she doesn't take responsibility. She just has a lot of excuses. And so for me to be in a relationship with her is a little bit more challenging. And what I've realized, I've got to focus on the stream. I love being with her. I don't like waiting for her. And I don't like drawing really negative conclusions about her. So what I say is, she's a late one. And since I don't like to wait for her, I'm just going to show up late. And she's going to be okay with it. So I started doing that. And sure enough, we showed up on time. I showed up consistently 15 minutes late. Made me feel uncomfortable because it goes against what I think is respectful. But okay, that's how she does it. And then we showed up together and happy. And this has happened years ago, and this is how we do it.
That's a good example of swimming around the boulder.
Exactly.
Debbie swam around the rock.
Exactly.
However, for some people, I don't know if I feel this way, but I wouldn't have come up with that solution. And for me, the not being on time, I might make a decision not to associate with that person anymore. And that's another option. Saying what you want sometimes means that you can't be with that person.
Right. And the reason that I don't like that, if we could avoid it at all costs, is because let's say I say to that person, I'm not being in a relationship. She's disrespectful. All these conclusions I come to, and I'm just not going to be in a relationship with her. I've set a boundary and I'm walking away.
Yeah.
I walk away with that energy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have to keep justifying it in my mind. And what I walk away from is the river. And we may have been friends in this case for years.
Yeah. Well, we argue about this a little bit. When is it appropriate to walk away? There's obviously times when you're in danger,
right,
and you need to protect yourself,
right,
where a boundary has to be made, and walking away is the best conclusion. Even in my life, where I've been held at gunpoint, or where somebody has created a dangerous situation for myself. I might try pushing back initially, but at some point, the smartest thing to do is to walk away.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Question.
Yeah, so we have a few questions here. I'm going to start with one most relevant to what you were just speaking to. How many chances should I give the person that keeps crossing boundaries before walking away?
Well, I don't know if there's a number, but I would check in with, where's your energy? Is the energy just on the rock or rocks, or is the energy on the river? And are we really highlighting the importance of the river and how how meaningful that is to you while we're talking about the rock? If I'm just pointing the energy on the rock, you can probably bet that the person's maybe being even passive aggressive or at least defensive. And so you're not putting your best foot forward in terms of being able to flow in the river together. So remember the river, point to the river, revel in the river, and then talk about the rock. But while you're in the river, not while you're on top of the rock.
And I just want to make one other point about this. Sometimes the only way to figure out what we do want in our lives is to figure out what we don't want. And while we don't want you to focus on what you don't want, that is what we call contrast. It's usually when we are very aware of what we don't want that we become very clear about what we do want.
Right.
So sometimes in relationships with people we care about very much and love, they are unable to give us what we want. They can't do it. They've tried, you've done everything. And it's pointing you in a direction that says, well, what do I want?
Right. I want to swim.
I want to swim in the river of love, and I can't get that here.
Right. Right.
I want to be respected and honored and loved and cherished, And I've tried,
There's a lot of rocks in this river,
A lot
so
of
I'm just
rocks.
going to make a little right turn
I'm gonna go up this other
where it's a little bit
stream.
easier to swim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's how we decide what we want in life. So sometimes it's painful and we find out what we don't want, and then we find out what we do want.
Another question. Is it better to set the boundary even if you don't do it or can't do it in a loving way?
Is it,
I would say no. What do you say?
I didn't understand the question.
Is it better to set the boundary? Is it better to set it even if you can't do it in a loving way? Is that right?
Yeah.
So it's like a boundary better
Right.
than no boundary, even if it's
Right.
not loving?
Yeah.
And I mean, I would say no, a little bit facetiously, but not really. I would say that it really depends. Like if the boundary is you can't hit me, then you can let loving go. It's a boundary. It's a strong boundary. So if it's one of severity and safety, then absolutely.
Yeah.
Set the boundary if you can't do it lovingly. But in most cases, get into the river, feel the love that you have for this person. That's what I mean when I say get in the river. Like really immerse yourself in the energy of the river rather than the energy of the rock when you set that boundary. And it's going to be an entirely different situation.
There are a lot of different areas where these types of difficult boundaries become really hard to set. I was looking at some notes earlier, just as a few that become very powerful to have a conversation about: being lied to, setting a boundary about somebody who
Right.
lies to you
Right.
a lot, being yelled at. How do you, having a conversation about that? A lot of couples will raise their voice and yell at each other. And for some, for some that seems to be okay. My grandparents used to yell at each other all the time. That's how they talk. It was weird.
But let's say, I don't want you to yell at me.
Yeah.
And so setting a boundary on top of the rock may be like, I can't stand it when you yell at me, and it's not okay with me.
Yeah.
I respect myself too much to have somebody make me feel like shit. And when you yell at me, I feel like shit. So no more yelling.
Well, maybe you should stop yelling at me then.
Exactly. So that's on top of the rock, setting a boundary, right? I'm focusing on what's wrong, what I don't like. So let's say I dive into the river, okay? And the river of love between us, and what do I appreciate? And it may sound more like this. Sweetheart, I know you're very passionate, and I know sometimes you get really upset with me. I do things that really, really trigger you. And when you yell, it makes me feel unsafe and disconnected. And I want to stay connected with you. And I want to hear what you have to say. And when you yell at me, it's like I can't hear anything. I care about what you care about. I care about what bothers you.
Yeah.
That's being in the river. Okay, comment.
We had a comment that speaks perfectly to what you're just saying. Isn't it about owning your boundary, giving an I message so defenses are down and the partner is emotionally available to hear?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
iMessages are absolutely important, because if you're not using iMessages, what I feel, what I need, what I want, you're usually blaming, criticizing, or shaming your partner in some way.
Yeah.
So,
anything that puts the partner down or demands that they do certain things, again, on top of the rock behavior, is going to be met with resistance, just like you did so wonderfully in that example.
So we were going to share another example of an area that we struggle with sometimes that has to do with setting a boundary around how your partner uses their time and space. So I thought we would just do that one.
Okay.
So why don't you start, since that's an area that you have had challenges with in the past.
Okay. We've kind of discussed this one already. So this is like a reenactment in a bit, and so do you want me to do it like
Mean?
Okay. So I never did it this way. I just want to go on record saying that this never happened exactly like this, but I may have wanted to. Okay. So, sweetheart, I'm looking at the calendar, and this just in the next 3 weeks, you have like 5 things where you're gone more than one day, one night. You've got this, you've got that, you've got that. And I'm like, it's like, I feel like you don't even care about us spending time. You know how important that is to me. And you just schedule all these things. It's like I don't even matter.
You're doing it. When we got one of the most important things for me, as you know, is my freedom, and I really need to be able to be my own person. And this is what gives me joy in life. I like going away. I like doing these things.
I feel like there's no joy with us together. Like I'm not even a consideration. I feel like I'm last on the list.
You're trying to put a little cramp on my style.
Okay, so this is kind of like the issue, or it was the issue, and it wasn't really portrayed like that, but we wanted to exaggerate a little bit. So the issue for me was Craig has been in the past and just until recently scheduling a lot of stuff without considering my schedule or our schedule. So another way of doing it, a more loving boundary, getting into the water, would be, honey, you have so many things in life that that capture your attention, that you're passionate about. You've got your yoga, you've got your OPJ, you've got your kids, you've got Mexico, you've got flute. And I love that you are a passionate man, and I love that you have these things. I really do.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing that when you're scheduling all these things that you love and care about so much, they're like right on top of each other. And so when I looked at the schedule of the next 3 weeks and that you're gone a lot of the time and that with your clients, I feel sad that, kind of don't feel like I'm a priority. Like you don't keep me in mind in your passion of scheduling things. And I'm sad that we're not going to be spending so much time together.
Oh, so I can see that you don't feel like you're a priority anymore.
Yeah.
You want to be more of a priority.
Yeah.
So what can I do to help?
Well, I think when you're scheduling things, if you can just keep in mind how the space between the things that you schedule, that would be a big help.
I can do that.
Because I don't want to tell you can't do anything. I would never do that. Because
Right.
I do love your involvement.
Mm-hmm.
The spacing sometimes gets cramped, and I feel like, what about me?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I can definitely do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Better, right? And the reason that's better is because, again, I'm reaffirming the stream, my love for him, my admiration for him, that he's this passionate guy that's got a lot of wonderful interests that he gets involved in. And he gets involved, he throws himself into these things, and I do admire it. It's just that I've got this other thing going on, which is me.
Yeah.
Where do I fit in?
Right.
So very different ways of handling it, right? One's in the stream and one's on top of the rock.
Yeah. One of the big ones in terms of boundaries that come up a lot with couples is division of responsibilities. I know that especially with COVID, I've talked to a lot of women and men who have children at home, little children. And a number of the couples, the partner is still going off to work. Typically, the mom is staying at home with the kids. And life is turned around, right? Upside down. So now they still have all the responsibilities they had before, plus they've got 2-3 kids at home that they're homeschooling. And that was really, really trying. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of hurt and resentment coming from what I'm hearing from couples where there were no boundaries around division of responsibility and who does what. And in these circumstances, they needed to change. The rules that were applying and were working were no longer working. Those who were able to sit down together and talk about it, about the changing of the rules, did well. Those who couldn't, anger, resentment built, and it was more and more difficult. So I think we see that in our office a lot, that couples, are not feeling like there's equality in terms of who's doing what. Another thing that I noticed recently is digital boundaries, particularly around for younger generation, who are way more involved than we are in every day with Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And there's developing a lot of rules and boundaries around what that means in our relationship. What can I share online? What can I not share? Passwords. Do I have to give you my passwords? So, that's a whole nother area that boundaries are really needing to be set up as well.
Or conversations.
At least a conversation.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Again, I think all those things are really wonderful opportunities to reaffirm what you appreciate about the person.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's been interesting to think about this topic on a number of levels. And one of them had to do with thinking about what it was like growing up in a family where boundaries were pretty messed up. And I don't think I'm the only one who grew up in a family where there weren't a whole lot of boundaries. And for me in particular, it was around anger. And so, I grew up in a family where anger was allowed to just be vented. And so I also ended up believing that that was appropriate. And so I ended up having children, and I didn't have any boundaries around anger for a long time until I finally did. But it was a long time, and people suffered as a consequence. So I guess I'm bringing that point up just to kind of bring the idea into play about how we learn about boundaries, where we get our boundaries from or don't get our boundaries from. So I want to say recently, I had an experience with my dad. And for years, for a lot of the reasons that all of you probably understand, I didn't speak back to him. He would break a boundary, what I would consider would be an inappropriate boundary, by raising his voice or talking down to me. And I would just take it because I didn't want to ruffle the feathers, and I was afraid if I would speak back, what would happen? And set a boundary and say, no, you can't talk to me that way. It's not acceptable. So for many, many, many years, that's kind of what our relationship was like. I just never said anything, and after a while, I just accepted it. About 2 weeks ago, I was talking to my dad, and he started to speak to me like he's been speaking to me for years. And I decided I wasn't going to take it anymore, but I wanted to do it with a loving boundary. And I matched his energy. So somebody looking out from the outside in would have probably thought that I was angry, but I wasn't angry, but I was forceful. I was strong, and I was powerful. And I said to my dad in no uncertain terms, no more. No more. This is not acceptable. If you want a relationship with your children, me, especially me, this will not work anymore. You need to stop talking to me this way. And I am telling you, a miracle, because everybody in my family noticed a difference. So, sometimes it feels like you're pushing back with anger, but you're just doing it in a powerful way. You're empowered to say what you need to say. But the love was still there. I wasn't disrespectful. I was just very respectful to myself.
And those boundaries are so powerful because when the person's pushing against them, like your dad was, it feels, it doesn't feel good. No. When he comes at you with anger, he's like boundaryless.
Right.
And it's like a child having a tantrum. And it just doesn't feel good. And that's why as parents, we have to put in place these boundaries for the safety of the child.
Right.
And when you put that boundary in place with your dad, I would imagine that there was an element of course, guilt, but also an element of safety. Like there's a boundary there, and I can't just go way out of control.
Yeah.
And I respect it because now with the boundary, there's clarity.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's loving clarity. And he came back to you with a lot of love. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know.
And he apologized.
And
he apologized and he asked for forgiveness, which was a shock. So.
Oh, cry. No, I'm teasing. It's an inside joke. It touched you.
It touched me.
Yeah.
But I want to say that what was so interesting, even more than that, was that I noticed myself being able to set boundaries after I did that with my kids in a way that was also loving. In other words, when I was able to do it with him, it transferred to them.
Right.
And I think also I had very loose boundaries with them, and I'm learning how to cultivate boundaries. So it's been a big learning for me. And
when you set boundaries like that, it's for the sake of the relationship.
Right.
Because when I don't have boundaries with somebody that I care about and I let them walk all over me, then I'm just taking the relationship and saying, it can be whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I care so much that I
Right.
want some integrity in this relationship
Mhm.
for all of us to feel
Right.
safe and to feel loving and to feel connected.
Exactly.
And it makes us both feel safe and connected. So
That's such a good point. And that is why setting boundaries has more to do with compassion and love than and integrity than divisiveness. So I think we all get a wrong picture about setting a boundary. It can be a loving boundary because it's respectful to you, it's respectful to the other person. When we set boundaries with our children, it's out of love. We need to do that throughout our lives.
And I think in life we have to look at like what really annoys us. We talked about pet peeves not too long ago, and we did that because what annoys us ends up frustrating us, and then it ends up angering us, and then we feel like we need a boundary, right? So I think we have to look at in life what really annoys us. What are the rocks that we swim within, and how do we address those rocks? And I think most of the time it's like get into the water and look at it. And a lot of times if I'm in the water, it doesn't look so big.
Mm.
And maybe I don't even have to set a boundary. Maybe I just say, oh, it's not that big a deal. I'm going to swim around, and it's not that I'm annoyed. It's not that I'm avoiding it. It's just like it's a lot in my head.
Yeah.
And the more I look at it, the bigger it gets, right?
Right.
So we have another question.
How is it different setting a boundary with a minor child than an adult?
Very different.
Patty, are you around?
Patty's
We
on
have-
the call.
Oh,
Is that
Patty's on the call?
Patty, can you answer that?
Let's bring Patty on because
Patty is a child development expert, and I often bring her into cases that I have where there's children. Setting boundaries with children is often the issue.
Oh, Greg, I cannot tell you how proud I am of you that you were assertive with your dad. I think that's a really, that's really a real statement that you made, that you were able to do that. Whether you asserted yourself, negatively or positively, it was important and it was powerful, and I'm really proud of you.
Can you address this question, Patty?
Talk to me. Tell me the question.
the question is, how is it different setting, or is it different setting a boundary with a child versus an adult? Is that it?
It's the same.
It's the
It's
same.
the same. The language is respectful. The request is respectful. There's no, you might want to talk to a 4-year-old with different language than you talk to, a 70-year-old or a 50-year-old, but the language is always the same. The request is about me. I feel like I had a private consultation with some parents today. The 4-year-old child keeps telling her dad to shut up. And that she wants to cut off the neck of her, 11 sister. So the boundary is the same. I don't like being told to shut up. I don't care for that. I need you to find a different way to talk to me. What is it that you need? I would say the same thing to my father-in-law. I don't care for the way you're talking to me. Find a different, same language, same concept. Yeah.
Same concept of how you said it. Maybe a little bit different in terms of how frequently and on what situations you would send it.
But I own it. I have the problem.
Right.
I'm having a problem with your communication. I don't care for it. You're fine. I don't want to be spoken to that way. So that's my style, is to say, I have the problem. Let's talk about how we can talk to each other differently. If the child refuses to brainstorm with me or can't or whatever, I take myself out of the situation.
Absolutely.
Beautiful,
Great.
Patty.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. We have another question.
Night-night.
Night-night.
What about when setting a boundary lovingly and your partner still thinks or feels that you are being controlling? What or how to handle that situation?
So that's a great question.
It is.
That could easily happen because, again, going back to the stories that we create about each other. So if I have a story, and sometimes I do about you, very controlling, and I'll tell you, that's a very controlling. So I'm going to see you through the lens of controlling.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you're really trying to be loving, I still may read it and receive it as controlling. So when somebody's trying to make a loving request, and I see it as controlling, it's really probably the story that I've created, and it's letting go of those stories and really trying to receive your partner in a new way, and vice versa. So I remember working in organizations, and we would give feedback to managers, and then we would send them out with these new behaviors. And lo and behold, nothing changed. The employees were still upset with them. And then we'd go in and we'd say, like, what's going on? And it's like, oh, they're like, trying all these new things out, and I can see right through it.
Yeah.
And so it was a lack of being able to receive something that's new. And again, the example I like to give is a child learning how to ride a bike, right? So it's like, it's not going to look pretty when they first start out, but make some space to receive somebody doing something that may still seem a little controlling, but is really, the attempt is at loving.
Yeah, and I mean, I think underneath the controlling behavior is probably fear. And what you want to look at and maybe work with your partner is asking him what he's afraid of. It's a very powerful question. And I think most conversations, if they lead to that question, can really get resolved a lot easier. What are you afraid of? And then being able to really hear that. And I can tell you that the question can be asked 2 or 3 times, and you'll get 2 or 3 different answers, because we're not usually just afraid of one thing.
Right.
We're usually afraid of many things. So if you could understand the control as fear.
And just asking the question is, again, to the same analogy, it's like I'm in the water.
I'm in the water with you.
I'm in the water with you. And if I stand on top of the rock, I'm just like, why are you so controlling?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'm being told that it's time. And we just want to thank everybody for coming on this call. I think it's an important conversation. And it's an important conversation because when we have breakdowns in relationships, we're often just jamming right into those rocks. And I think that there's a very different way of dealing with the rocks that show up in all of our relationships. And that is to get into the water, to remind ourselves why we're in a relationship. What's our history? This person has supported me, been there for me, fulfilled me. And now there's this little rock. So in the water, as I look at this little rock, now how's the rock changed?
Yeah, it's beautiful. And for next week, if you'd like to email us a recommendation or a suggestion on a topic, otherwise we'll choose one.
We have some ideas, but we would love to hear from you.
So thank you for joining us. We love you. We love having you as our community. Mindful Mondays is awesome. You're awesome. And we'll hope to see you next time.
Okay, thanks guys. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Good to see you, Steve.
Oh,
Yeah, good to see you guys too.
Hi, Emma, Steve,
Who's that?
Cindy, Susanna,
Yeah.
Angela.
Hi, Cindy. Good to see you,
We
Cindy.
can't see you, but Angela.
Emma's so beautiful.
Oh, there she is. Hi, Angela. Who else do we have?
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you